Hello. It is 8:45 on Tuesday morning in Jonesboro, and I was looking at my phone weather app. It's 32 degrees there this morning on this Tuesday morning. And here in Caen, France, it's 47 degrees and it's already 3:45 p.m. So it's 7 hours later here than it is in Jonesboro. So by the time you have class tomorrow at 2 p.m., it will already be 9 p.m. here in Caen. A little bit of an adjustment for me, but I do appreciate you giving me the opportunity and being patient with me this semester as I traveled over here to France. I certainly recommend that you try this and come to Europe. And specifically, France has been wonderful for me. It's my first trip here, and I've already learned a lot. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I will show you behind me. Hopefully, you can see it. On the screen is the university, one of the buildings, and it's the building that I'm teaching in at IAE Con. And, and so the students there are MBA students from several different countries. Some are from France and some are from all over the world. Luckily, I get to teach the class in English. It's a class about international law because I don't speak French very well at all. And I'm learning a few new words every day. Certainly, ordering in a restaurant can be challenging when you don't know many words, but the French people have been very kind, and I've enjoyed being here a lot. Last weekend, I got to travel to Paris, and I'm going to go back there in about 3 weeks. While I'm here in the Caen area, I'm going to be going to Normandy Beach to see some historic sites, and I'll probably be doing several other things. But also, I'm working very hard on my class teaching, and I want to be sure that you also get what you're expecting to get out of real estate law. So we're going to continue on with Chapter 11, kind of a quick review of some things we discussed before the fall break, because I don't want you to forget, and the final's coming up before we know it. So estates and land are what we are talking about. We've already talked about freehold estates, which are things like fee simple, absolute, life estate, ownership types of estates. Leasehold estates are also a different type, a different category of an estate and land. It is a form of ownership of land. It's just not as permanent as a freehold. And there are four types of leasehold estates. There's estate for years, periodic tenancy, tenancy at will, and tenancy at sufferance. So the estate for years could be a 6-month, 9-month, 12-month, 2-year, 99-year lease. It's just got a fixed term in the lease. A periodic tenancy endures for some time and then for successive periods of equal length. So you might have a month-to-month lease or a year-to-year lease or something of that nature. One very important thing is the requirement of notice to terminate the tenancy. So if the tenant wants to move out and terminate the lease and stop paying rent, they have some requirements to terminate, and the same requirements apply to the landlord. So you can't just say, well, it's month to month, so I'm just going to move out and quit paying rent. It's not that simple. You need to watch for how much time and notice has to be given to terminate. All right, there's also basically, periodic tenancy often happens when someone who has an estate for years, say a 1-year lease, just stays in possession. Oftentimes, that is considered an offer to rent the premises under a periodic tenancy. So the lease just keeps going, and again requires some notice if you want to terminate it. Holdover tenant is somebody who just stays after expiration of a leasehold. Tenancy at will is when it's kind of like your buddy says, hey, come over, you can stay in my house and pay some rent until I sell the house. And so there's not a really secure feeling there when you do that. On the other hand, it can work in some cases. There's also something called tenancy at sufferance, where the tenant stays there even though the tenant's rights have terminated. So you may want the tenant out if you're the landlord. The tenant may refuse to move. You may have to go through court proceedings to get this tenant at sufferance out of your property. All right, there's also something to remember. There's a distinction between licenses and leases. So a license is just a privilege to enter the property for a certain purpose. For example, a hunting license to enter someone's farm for that one purpose. But it doesn't give the licensee any title, interest, or estate in the property. Now, a good example to look at in the book is the Nextel case at the end of the chapter. It's the first end of chapter case at the end of chapter 11. And so if you look at the Nextel case, you can see how a court might look at this. Nextel said, I want it to be a lease. Time Management Corporation said, we think it's a license. And there were reasons why it mattered. The court had to look at it and make a determination. And the court said it depends on the parties' intentions. And the court read the document that had been signed by the parties and said, it's for 5 years. It renews every 5 years. It is automatically renewed after 5 years. Nextel employees have unlimited access to the premises. And basically, it looks like a lease. It seems the parties intended a lease, so the court said, we're going to make it a lease, and Nextel, you're win the case here. Choosing a tenant can be difficult. So you want a tenant, of course, that will pay their rent, but you want a tenant who has not going to mess the place up. So you may want to do a credit check or a criminal background check or different things about tenants. But you are prohibited from looking at membership in a protected group, such as race or gender. And testers are people who work for the government agencies or public interest groups who pose as tenants to find out whether landlords are violating anti-discrimination laws. So you could have a landlord who charges different rent depending on someone's race, or says, yes, I have an apartment available to one person of one race, and on the same day, same circumstance, says, no, I don't have any, to someone of a different race. That is a violation of the law. You also, as a landlord, have to watch for disabled tenants. Illegal discrimination can arise if you have physical structures and obstacles that discriminate against disabled tenants. You also have to let those tenants modify their dwelling at their own expense if that will make the dwelling best for them. Landlords generally, though, can require the tenant to pay to restore the apartment to the condition prior to the modification when the tenant leaves. Commercial landlords also almost always must comply with Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So any place of a public accommodation cannot discriminate against disabled individuals. So there may be requirements that are very specific about ramps and elevators and all kinds of other things that will help disabled individuals have access to these public places like shopping centers, bars, and restaurants. A number of states have statutes and court rulings that forbid landlords from refusing to rent to a couple that is living together but not married, even if the landlord says it violates their religious values. Landlord can screen out some potentially troublesome tenants. They can't say based on race or gender or other protected classes, but some landlords actually test prospective tenants for drugs, for example, to try to screen out potentially troublesome tenants. And we will see in this chapter that, having a troublesome tenant can not only cause damage to your apartment or whatever property you're leasing, but also can cause you to incur liability to other tenants if the tenant causes them harm. So retaliatory eviction is another term I want you to know. If a tenant does not like the leased premises because it is in bad condition or it violates the law, maybe the building codes or the safety codes are violated, the landlord is not permitted to evict the tenant in retaliation for that. Now, there are some required lease provisions that I want you to quickly review. So do keep in mind residential versus commercial as we go through this chapter. I do want to mention here, residential tenants typically have more protection under state law. than commercial tenants. Commercial tenants are deemed to be a little more sophisticated, we hope, than residential tenants. They tend to have more choices and more money. Residential tenants have to have housing. They want to have a place to live. They're a little bit at the mercy of the landlord. They may be less financially secure, or at least they may be less knowledgeable and less in a position to bargain. And so residential tenants do have generally more protections from the landlord's abuses. Do remember, though, as I mentioned at the last class, in Arkansas there are some issues with landlord-tenant law, and landlords are generally favored more in Arkansas than they are in many other states. Every lease, whether residential or commercial, needs to include 4 essential provisions: name and signature of the parties, a description of the property, the term of the lease, and the amount of the rent. The lease in some states has to be witnessed and acknowledged as well. And so I do want to mention quickly rent and security deposit. So let me take a quick look. Page 438. The rent can be stated in several different ways. It can be a specific dollar amount, $800 a month, or it could be a graduated rental for predetermined periodic increases. So you could say $800 a month for the first 6 months, $900 the second 6 months, and so on, and it just goes up. Another way you could handle this is a cost of living index method, particularly if you're dealing with a commercial tenant who's going to be there a while. You might say, we're going to look at the cost of living once every year or every 5 years or whatever, and increase the rent or decrease the rent. Normally it would be increase based on that index. Another way is an appraisal method that calculates rent as a percentage of the appraised value of the rental property. And another method I wanted to mention, and primarily retail leasing, is a percentage method. The rent's based on the volume of the tenant's business. And we're talking about gross income. So if you have tenants in a shopping center and those tenants have cyclical business, so maybe in Turtle Creek Mall, a lot of the stores probably have a lot of gross income in December because people shop for the holidays. February, maybe a little bit for Valentine's Day, but not nearly as much. Certainly, when you get down to something like April or January or certain other months, shopping may be very low. And so those tenants may like to have a system where they pay at least part of their rent based on gross income. So they pay more rent at certain times. It also gives some reward to the landlord for giving prime space to the tenants who are going to do the most business by having the right space. And so I think it's a decent system for those types of things. Now, there are other suggested lease provisions that I wanted to mention that you really should have in your lease. They're not required to make the lease valid, but there are basically 3 categories of issues that can cause big disputes, and so they should be addressed. One is the condition of the premises. Who is going to keep the premises in good condition, and who's going to pay for all of that? And so that's a super important one. What condition is it going to be in? Secondly, the tenant's use of the property is an important issue. And thirdly, the transfer of the leased interest. Can you assign the lease to someone else if you don't want to stay? I did want to mention at this point a case that you should look at, and we looked at it before the break. Make sure you do take a look at the case which was the Tenant Health System Surgical versus Jefferson case on page 469. It deals with this situation of consent to a proposed assignment of a lease. And in that situation, remember, the lease did mention reasonableness, that the consent would not be unreasonably withheld. And so be sure and look at that case. I'm going to stop right now, and I'll come back in a few moments and discuss a little bit more.